Welcome back to the third chapter of our no-holds-barred journey through the Sega Genesis most controversial classics. We've already torn through some real renegades in parts 1 and 2, but if you thought those were wild, hold on to your controllers. Today we're cranking the Genesis Attitude to 11. In this series we're dusting off the 16-bit cartridges to uncover the stories behind the games that made Sega the bad boy of the console wars. Be sure to smash that like button and subscribe if you're new, and let's blast into another 10 controversial Sega Genesis games. Mortal Kombat 2. Mortal Kombat 2 stormed in like a fatality straight out of the arcade, ready to rip the console scene apart. Midway's sequel took everything from the first game and dialed it to 11. A bigger roster, faster fights, and a gore factor that went wild with spine-snapping finishers and quirky friendship moves. But here's where the real fight broke out. Its graphic violence landed like a punch to the gut in the early 90s culture war. Unlike the toned-down Super Nintendo version, the Genesis kept the blood flowing, unlocked with that legendary cheat code from the original, letting players drench the screen with every uppercut. This hit right after the first Mortal Kombat sparked Senate hearings and birthed the ESRB. So Mortal Kombat 2's 1993 drop turned parents and lawmakers into a mob, screaming it was a violence playground for kids. Sega slapped a mature rating on it and leaned hard into its edgy image, but that didn't stop the uproar, or the millions of copies flying off the shelves. For fighters, it was a brutal rush. For the Outrage Brigade, it was gaming's bloody breaking point. The controversy didn't just spill blood, it fueled a Genesis-fueled firestorm that shook the console wars to their core. This wasn't just about gore, it was a showdown of grit and rivalry. The Genesis port squeezed arcade chaos into 16 bits, packing digitized fighters into every round. But it wasn't flawless. Animations could stutter, and the sound had a raw, tinny edge compared to its Super Nintendo rival. Sega fans ate it up anyway. The darker, grittier vibe fit Mortal Kombat 2's vibe like a glove, and local multiplayer turned buddies into bitter enemies, trading blows over who'd land the next fatality. The game's arrival cemented Sega's blast processing swagger, proving it could handle arcade-level brutality without flinching, unlike Nintendo's scrubbed-down take. But that freedom came with heat. Its weaponized chaos and in-your-face attitude made it a lightning rod for anyone itching to bend gaming's wild side. Mortal Kombat 2 wasn't just a sequel, it was a Genesis-powered war cry, a cultural clash of loyalty and limits that dared everyone to pick a side in the 90s fight for gaming's soul.
Technocop. Busted.
Technocop. Technocop screeches onto the Sega Genesis in 1990. A game so raw it practically dared the 90s to blink first. Developed by Punk Entertainment and unleashed by Razorsoft, this futuristic cop caper mashed up pseudo 3D driving with side-scrolling shootouts, putting you in the boots of a lone enforcer tearing through a crime-riddled wasteland. You'd blast down highways in a sleek red ride, smashing enemy cars, then ditch the wheels to storm seedy hideouts, unloading a pistol that turned thugs into exploding crimson clouds or snaring them with a net gun, all in a pixelated blaze of glory. But here's where the controversy came in. Technocop was one of the first Genesis games to slap a warning label on the box, advising against kids under 12 playing it due to its graphic violence. In an era where Nintendo scrubbed blood from its ports, Sega greenlit this gore fest. Enemies didn't just die, they burst apart in a symphony of body parts and screamed, dropping just as moral panic over games simmered. This was Razorsoft's testing Sega's edgy limits, and it paid off, with a buzz that had parents clutching pearls and kids sneaking cartridges past bedtime. Sega's slogan, "Sega does what Nintendo don't," swagger was in full flex, but for some this was less a game and more a Molotov cocktail tossed into the family room. The chaos didn't stop at blood splatter. It roared into Technocop's very DNA. igniting a firestorm over its execution and its place in Genesis lore. The game's wrist-mounted computer barked vague directions, leaving you to trial and error your way through the game, all while a brutal timer ticked down faster than a bomb fuse. It was ambitious, yes, blending driving and running gun vibes with the dystopian edge straight out of an 80s action flick, but that ambition hit a brick wall with sluggish controls and repetitive levels that recycled the same tiles and foes ad nauseum. Sega fans were split. Some ate up the B-movie charm and over-the-top violence, seeing it as a middle finger to Nintendo's censorship, while others saw a clunky mess that couldn't cash the checks its warning label wrote. Dropping in a pre-ESRB world where Sega's lax oversight let Razorsoft run wild, Technocop became a lightning rod, praised for pushing boundaries, panned for stumbling over them, and forever etched as a Genesis rebel that roared out loud but didn't always roll smooth. Altered Beast. Altered Beast clawed its way into the Sega Genesis in 1988 as a launch title, ready to flex its monstrous muscles. Born in the arcades and ported by Sega, this beat-em-up cast you as a resurrected warrior summoned by Zeus himself to rescue Athena from the underworld's gnarly overlord, Neph. You'd punch and kick through hordes of zombies and demons, grabbing power orbs to morph into beasts, each with claws, fire breath, or electric blasts that shredded foes into gooey bits. But here's where the controversy came in. Its graphic violence and occult vibes hit the Genesis like a lightning bolt in '88, a time when video games were still dodging the satanic panic of the '80s. Enemies didn't just fall, they exploded into bloody chunks or melted into puddles. And the whole rise from your grave premise had religious watchdogs howling about demonic influence on kids. Sega doubled down, making it a pack-in title with the Genesis in '89, plastering its gore across millions of homes. For arcade vets, it was a gritty thrill. For pearl clutchers, it was a beastly menace lurking in the family TV. The controversy didn't stop there. It tore into Altered Beast's bones, splitting the Genesis crowd like a werewolf through a two-headed mutt. The game was a showcase for Sega's 16-bit swagger, big sprites, meaty sound effects, and an iconic "Rise from your grave" voice booming through tinny speakers. You'd brawl across 5 stages, graveyards, caves, and a grotesque palace, each capped with bosses like a blob-spewing octopus or a rhinoceros freak that make you earn those beast powers the hard way. But the claws came out over its execution. The Genesis port trimmed the arcade sheen, slower pacing, choppier animations, and a 2-player mode that lagged like a zombie on a leash. Some fans loved the raw primal vibe. Those beast transformations were a power trip, while others saw a stiff repetitive slog that leaned too hard on its shock factor. Dropping in an era when Sega was carving out its tough guy niche against Nintendo's polish, Altered Beast became a battleground, a bold mascot for the Genesis edge, yet a punching bag for its flaws, leaving players debating whether it was a howling classic or a relic that should have stayed buried. Sonic 3D Blast. Sonic 3D Blast sped onto the Sega Genesis in 1996, aiming to give Sonic a 3D glow-up on 16-bit turf. Developed by Traveler's Tales and Sonic Team, this wasn't your classic side-scroller that fans wanted for a true next-gen Sonic. This shift to 3D sparked a backlash. Gone were the lightning-fast loops and slopes, replaced by a slower, deliberate pace that felt like Sonic had traded his sneakers for cement boots. Genesis loyalists saw it as a desperate grab to keep the system alive, while others cried it was a betrayal of Sonic's speed demon soul, landing in a cultural limbo where Sega's mascot took heat for not evolving. The sparks didn't stop at the concept, they flew into Sonic 3D Blast's guts, turning it into a Genesis grudge match that split the fanbase like a spin dash through a badnik. The controls were slippery, causing Sonic's momentum to feel off, and flicking flickies at robots got old fast, especially with a live system that punished missteps hard. Some fans dug the fresh vibes while others raged at the clunky handling and repetitive fetch quests, arguing this was a watered-down shell of the 2D trilogy's magic. To make matters worse, it dropped alongside a sharper Saturn version that only fanned the flames. Genesis owners felt shortchanged, stuck with a port that couldn't keep pace. Sonic 3D Blast became a sonic boom of a debate, a daring experiment for some, a misfired blast for others, and a controversial pivot that showed Sega scrambling to keep their blue blur relevant on a dying console. Toxic Crusaders. Toxic Crusaders stomped onto the Sega Genesis in 1992, a beat-em-up that's as wild as a mutant mop in a toxic wasteland. Developed by Infogrames and published by Sega, this game spun off the short-lived cartoon, a kid-friendly riff on Troma's gory Toxic Avenger movies, casting you as Toxie, No Zone, or Junkyard, a trio of mutated do-gooders bashing pollution-loving punks across Tromaville. You'd punch through hazmat goons, ride skateboards over slime pits, and mop up melted enemies, all in a neon-soaked romp with 6 levels of chaos. But here's where the controversy bubbled up. Its cartoonish violence landed in 1992, right as the gaming world braced for the Mortal Kombat-fueled Senate hearings that birthed the ESRB. Sure, it wasn't Mortal Kombat's spine-ripping gore, but melting foes into puddles and blasting bosses with a souped-up mop still spooked parents who saw the Genesis as a kid's toy, especially with Sega's lax oversight letting this tie-in slip through uncensored. Sega leaned hard into its not Nintendo vibe, but for moral watchdogs this was a toxic spill too close to Saturday morning innocence, sparking debates about where the line set for family-friendly gore. The mess didn't stop at the slime. It oozed into Toxic Crusaders' roots and execution, turning it into a Genesis slugfest that split fans like a Radiation Ranger's skull. This wasn't just some random brawler, it was a Frankenstein's monster stitched from a cult B-movie turned eco-cartoon canceled after 13 episodes, leaving the game as a weird relic of a failed franchise. You'd brawl through disjointed stages with Toxie narrating every intro, even if you picked Junkyard or No Zone, hinting at a rushed job that didn't gel. The gameplay mixed beat-em-up punches with awkward platforming, while the Genesis' bright palette clashed with its gritty Troma DNA, leaving players torn. Some loved the absurdity, mopping up goo while rocking a 2-player co-op that let you hurl your buddy like a projectile, while others saw a sloppy cash-in plagued by floaty jumps and a randomness that screamed, "What even is this?" Dropping in a pre-ESRB Wild West where Sega greenlit anything to flex its edge, Toxic Crusaders became a battleground, a quirky cult hit for some, a half-baked misfire for others, and a controversial snapshot of Genesis Gaming's Anything Goes era. Before we move on with our list, I'd love to know what you think so far. Sound off in the comments below if you're enjoying this video. And while you're down there, be sure to hit the like button. It helps out more than you know. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any upcoming videos. Okay, back to the list. EX-Mutants. EX-Mutants leapt from the pages of Malibu Comics onto the Sega Genesis in 1992, landing like a mutant fist in a post-apocalyptic punch bowl. Developed by Malibu Interactive and published by Sega, this action platformer flung players into a nuked-out 2055 Earth, where you pick either Aykroyd or Shannon, 2 ex-mutants turned human by a cyborg professor, to rescue their squad from the slimy warlord Slugdude. Armed with axes, nunchucks, and a stash of grenades, you'd slash through wastelands, sewers, and skyscrapers, leaving a trail of mutant guts and exploding foes in your wake. But here's where the controversy came in. Its graphic violence dropped in 1992, putting the game's gore under a microscope. The Genesis thrived on its edgy reputation, and EX-Mutants, with enemies bursting into bloody bits, leaned hard into that, snagging a teen rating that clashed with the console's broad audience. Parents and watchdogs saw this comic tie-in as a step too far, especially with its dystopian vibe and body count, sparking debates about whether Sega was pushing the envelope or just tossing a grenade into family gaming. The fallout didn't just simmer over its guts, it festered in EX-Mutants' comic roots and shaky execution, splitting the Genesis crowd like a mutant horde at a human buffet. This wasn't some random brawler. It was tied to a niche Malibu comic series that bounced through publishers and reboots, landing as a gritty 90s revamp with a whiff of X-Men knockoff vibes. 3 guys, 3 girls, all fighting a grotesque tyrant. The game promised big. 9 levels of mutant-smashing action, plus a story where you'd save your pals to rebuild humanity. But the catch? It stumbled hard. Floaty controls made jumps a crapshoot, enemies blended into muddy backgrounds, and the Genesis sound chip churned out a racket some fans still hear in their nightmares. Sega fans were torn. Some loved the obscure tie-in and its wild premise, while others saw a clunky cash grab that couldn't match the polish of Sonic or Streets of Rage. EX-Mutants became a battleground, hailed as a quirky gem by some, trashed as a half-baked mess by others, and a controversial snapshot of Genesis gaming's raw, unfiltered edge. Bubsy in Claws Encounters of the Furred Kind. Claws Encounters of the Furred Kind pounced onto the Genesis in 1993, aiming to claw its way into the mascot mania. Developed by Accolade, this platformer starred Bubsy, a wisecracking bobcat with a smirk, racing through 16 levels of yarn balls, roller coasters, and alien woolies who'd nabbed Earth's yarn supply. You'd glide, pounce, and dodge spike pits along vibrant worlds like Fairy Tales and Planet Rayon, all while Bubsy quipped lines like, "What could possibly go wrong?" But here's where the fur flew. Its violent light chaos landed in '93, and while it wasn't gory, Bubsy's one-hit deaths and cartoonish hazards like buzzsaws and runaway trains spooked some parents who saw the Genesis as a kid's domain, earning it a subtle backlash for its reckless edge. Sega fans loved the sass, but for watchdogs, this bobcat's antics were a sneaky paw into a console war already bristling with tension over appropriate fun. The real claws came out over Bubsy's execution, turning it into a Genesis scrap that split players like a yarn ball in a blender. Accolade hyped it as a mascot killer. 16 sprawling stages, 3 warp-filled bonus rounds, and a soundtrack by Matt Berindo that bounced from jazzy beats to sci-fi synths, all screaming 90s cool. But the catch? It was a hot mess. Bubsy's controls were floaty as a helium balloon, with momentum so wild you'd overshoot platforms or splat into spikes faster than you could say meow. The Genesis version leaned into Sega's darker palette, but that didn't save it from a brutal difficulty curve. 9 lives burned quick when one touch meant game over, and checkpoints were rarer than a quiet Bubsy. Fans were split hard. Some adored the quirky charm, while others raged at the sloppy physics and repetitive collect yarn grind, calling it a Sonic wannabe that tripped over its own tail. Dropping in a year when Sega's blast processing hype was peaking, Bubsy in Claws Encounters became a furball of controversy, praised as a bold oddity by some, panned as a mascot misfire by others, and a Genesis gamble that couldn't quite stick the landing. Zero Tolerance. Zero Tolerance blasted onto the Genesis in 1994, a first-person shooter that's as bold as it is bloody, shaking up a console not built for this kind of chaos. Developed by Technocop, Zero Tolerance threw you into a sci-fi nightmare. a Planet Defense Corps squad, 5 commandos with weapons like shotguns and flamethrowers, storming a hijacked space station, Europa 1, overrun by alien freaks and human traitors. You'd navigate maze-like corridors, splattering enemies into pixelated guts, all from a gritty behind-the-gun view that screamed Doom vibes. But here's where the controversy started. Its graphic violence landed like a gut punch in '94, boasting blood-soaked halls with spiders twitching as you gun them down, that caused parents and watchdogs to freak out. Instead of coming with a warning for violence, it came with a coupon for a link cable that enabled players to engage in a cooperative 2-player mode at full resolution and speed, but the downside was that you needed 2 Genesis consoles, 2 copies of the game, and 2 TV sets, one for each player in order to do so. For shooter fans, it was a Genesis miracle. For the moral panic crowd, it was a neon sign screaming gaming's descent into chaos. The heat didn't just flare over gore, it erupted from zero tolerance's wild ambition and the Sega faithful's split reaction, turning it into a 16-bit battlefield. This wasn't just another platformer, it was a tech flex, one of the Genesis' only first-person shooter titles, with tricks like blood-splattering walls, elevators shifting in real time, and 2-player co-op. You'd pick a commando, blasting through docking bays and skyscrapers, juggling weapons like mines and lasers in a tiny box by a massive HUD, but the Genesis limits bit back, sluggish frame rates, a squash view, and controls that turned like a rusty tank had players raging. Some saw genius in the maze-like levels, others saw a clunky Doom wannabe that couldn't keep up. Sega fans were split. Some hailed it as a gritty underdog proving the system's chops, while others trashed it as a half-baked mess, especially with whispers of a cancelled sequel, teasing more that never came. In a console war where Sega bet big on attitude, zero tolerance was a controversial gamble. Too raw to tame, too rough to rule, and a snapshot of Genesis pushing the boundaries till they broke. Decap Attack. Decap Attack launched on the Genesis in 1991, a platformer so bizarre it's practically begging for a double take. This ghoulish romp starred Chuck D. Head, a headless mummy who throws his own skull to bash pumpkin foes and skeleton bats across 7 islands of a shattered monstered empire. You'd hop through levels like Elbow Island and Abdomen Land, dodging lava pits and collecting potions to summon a bouncing skull buddy or stretch your gut for extra reach, all tied to a wacky plot about reassembling a demon's domain. But here's where the controversy crept in. Its macabre vibe hit in '91, still simmering in the tail end of the '80s satanic panic, when anything spooky could shock parents and preachers. The Genesis thrived on edge, but Decap Attack's blood-free gore, ripping off your head, fighting undead hordes, had some clutching crosses and worried it was too dark for a console creeping into kids' rooms. A reskin of a Japanese game Magical Doropi, it swapped witches for mummies, but kept the weird fueling debates. Was this a quirky thrill or a grim misstep in Sega's family-friendly fight? The skull didn't stop rolling there. It tumbled into Decap Attack's guts, splitting the Genesis crowd like a headshot from Chuck himself. Vic Takai packed it with Genesis flair, bright sprites popping against lava reds and swamp greens, a soundtrack swinging from funky beats to eerie wails, and 7 worlds with secrets like totem pole warps and underwater mazes. You'd pelt enemies with your cranium, glide on bat wings, or belly flop bosses like a shark-toothed crab. Wild stuff for a platformer. But the execution? That's where the bones rattled. Controls were slippery. Chuck's head throws had a mind of their own, and the one-hit deaths piled up fast, with lives burning quicker than a match in a crypt. Some fans adored the offbeat charm. Those Halloween vibes and goofy puns like Chuck Roast screamed 90s cool, while others groaned at the stiff jumps and grindy pace, calling it a Sonic wannabe that lost its head trying to stand out. Where Sega's loose reins let oddities fly, Decap Attack became a Frankenstein's monster of controversy, loved as a cult oddball by some, loathed as a clunky corpse by others, and a Genesis gem that danced on the edge of creepy and chaotic. Bloodshot. Bloodshot stormed into the Genesis in 1994, a rare first-person shooter that's equal parts ambitious and abrasive, ready to battle the 16-bit scene. Developed by Domark, this sci-fi bloodbath, also called Battle Frenzy in Germany, dropped you into 2049 as a cyber trooper with a Battle Frenzy chip jacked into your skull, turning you into a killing machine tasked with blasting robotic aliens across an infested ship. You'd mow down foes with pulse guns, rocket launchers, and weirdo weapons like the Piercer, leaving piles of metallic guts as you race to blow up plasma nodes and escape self-destructing levels, all in a pseudo-3D maze that pushed the Genesis to its limits. But here's the controversy trigger. Sega's edgy rep was peaking, but Bloodshot's relentless robot slaughter and that unstoppable desire to kill plot had parents and regulators twitchy, especially since it launched without a clear rating in some regions, slipping through as a cartridge in Europe, while North America got it via the Sega channel only. For shooter fans, it was a Genesis unicorn. For the moral panic posse, it was another nail in gaming's coffin, amplifying Sega's rebel streak in a way that didn't sit right with everyone. The storm didn't just rage over its guts, it brewed in Bloodshot's very bones, splitting the Genesis crowd like a plasma core meltdown. Boasting 12 sprawling levels, secret rooms behind sliding panels, and a 2-player split-screen mode that turned buddies into rivals. You'd strafe through corridors, snag keys, and dodge sticky walls that could trap you in an instant, all while the clock ticked down like a death sentence after every boss kill. But the Genesis limits bit hard. Fuzzy graphics, jerky controls, and a frame rate that chugged when the screen got busy had players split. Some saw it as a gritty triumph over hardware odds, others a clunky Doom ripoff that couldn't keep up. The name swap to Battle Frenzy in Germany, dodging Bloodshot's violent vibe, only fueled the fire, with the fans debating whether it was a censorship gone soft or a smart sidestep, especially since the game had no actual blood, just robot wreckage. Dropping in a year when Sega's focus was shifting to the Saturn, Bloodshot became a battleground, praised as a bold experiment by some, panned as a choppy relic by others, and a controversial misfit that showed Genesis could shoot for the stars even if it didn't always hit the mark. These games stormed in with guts and grit, from blood-drenched brawls to mutant-fueled chaos, hitting shelves between 88 and 96, when the console wars were a full-on street fight. Some leaned hard into graphic violence, landing right as lawmakers and parents clutched their pitchfork, pre- and post-Senate hearing panic over gaming's dark side. Others stirred the pot with occult vibes or dystopian twist, tweaking lingering 80s fears or late 90s unease, their mature edge clashing with a console creeping into every kid's home. Sega's edgy swagger shone through, warning labels, uncensored ports, pushing boundaries that thrilled players hungry for rebellion but spooked the moral crowd into seeing controllers as ticking time bombs. These weren't just cartridges, they were cultural Molotovs, proving this system thrived on raw, unfiltered attitude that split the room between cheers and jeers. Hey everyone, thank you so much for watching. What are your thoughts on the games on this list? Let me know in the comments below because I would love to get a conversation going with you. If you liked this video, please leave a like. If you didn't, that other button seems to work pretty well too. If you're new here, please consider subscribing for a plethora of gaming-related content, including but not limited to controversial games. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.